What is going on, guys? I am Paul Ryan, your host of the ATB Fantasy Show. If you're new to the show, thank you for joining us. And to our regular listeners, welcome back. With me, as always, is my co-host, the best co-host in the world, Dave Hartman. Dave, how are you?
I'm doing well, Paul. I got my I keep turning the wrong way. I got my Justin Tuck jersey up behind me because we're going to be talking about the NFC East. We'll talk about that in a second. But I'm doing well. How are you doing tonight, Paul?
I'm doing well. I'm looking at your background. I keep thinking that maybe you're getting ready for a baby shower. Or, you guys are expecting soon, Dave.
No. My kids are all in their 20s or older, so no, not expecting anything. There's a long story for what's behind me, but I won't get into it.
Well, Dave, while we're talking, let the people know where they can find you on Twitter.
Yep, thanks, Paul. You can find me at Pigskin Papers. Both of those P's are capitalized, and my website where I post all of my content is thepigskinpapers.com. Paul, where can people find you on Twitter? Where can they find your content?
Yes, you can find me on Twitter at Paul_Ryan15. Most of my content is either streamed on Twitter or on YouTube, and my written work can be found on King Fantasy Sports, where I do most of my writing in season.
Excellent. So I mentioned earlier we're going to be talking about the NFC East, where we've been doing a series of deep dives for fantasy into each division. And tonight we have a very special guest to help us break down the NFC East. Please welcome Prue Patel to the show. Prue is a writer at The League Winners. And just thinking about the NFC East for a second, it's I think it's one of the best divisions in the NFL year in and year out. And I'm not just saying that because I happen to marry into Giants season tickets and my whole family, except for me, are Giants fans. I'm a Dolphins fan, but I've adopted the Giants as my second team, and I get to a couple games a year. And I try to always go to at least one division game a year because this division has really some of the best rivalries in the NFL. The fans of the teams despise each other, talk a lot of smack. It's an old division, a lot of history. Last 10 years, the Cowboys have won it 4 times. The Eagles have won it 4 times. The Commanders have won it twice. The Giants have not won the division in the last 10 years, but they won it a bunch of times in the decade before. This was I think the only division last year where 3 teams from the division made the playoffs. And not only that, all 3 of those teams won at least one game. So this was a tough division last year. For much of the season, all the teams were over 500 and were all in it. All had a shot at the playoffs. The Eagles obviously came very close to winning an NFL championship last year. And there's a lot of good fantasy assets in this division, most notably on the Eagles and Cowboys, but there's some good finds on the other teams as well. And so as everyone starts to kind of really get into redraft season now and start thinking about where the fantasy goodness is, this is not a division to be overlooked. So, Prue, let's get to know you a little bit. How long have you been playing fantasy football?
So I think I started playing fantasy football around 2007 and 2008 when I was in college. That's when I started playing redraft a lot. And then Dynasty, I sort of started 2019. So very recently in the Dynasty realm. It was around the same time when I, kind of joined Twitter, was when I kind of found Dynasty leagues and whatnot. Funny you kind of bring the Ravens fan into the NFC East discussion, but I do live very close to the Giants and the Eagles and the Commanders, so I kind of see them in the news a lot.
Yeah, you're right in that I-95 corridor. And I should have asked you before, Prue. I'm sorry. What is your Twitter handle? Where can people follow you there?
Yeah, definitely. You can find me on Twitter at the Prue Patel. And currently, I've sort of got promoted at the League Winners as co-director of the Dynasty content, and also we're bringing in a little bit of stats and whatnot for redraft this year. So I'm going to be spearheading that at the website. And recently, I have just joined with In Between Media, writing a little bit more about finance and lifestyle, but integrating some fantasy football into the articles as well.
Interesting.
Well, congratulations on the promotion there, Prue.
Thanks.
So I'm curious, what inspired you to start writing content? It sounds like you're, not necessarily new to Dynasty, but still a little bit wet behind the ears, if you will.
Yeah, so I actually joined Twitter because in my work league, a friend and I were kind of trying to spice things up, and we were like, had a bet on the side that said if I change my tight end and kicker every week, I'll still make the playoffs. Unfortunately, the commissioner rejected it. He thought there might be a little bit of collusion or whatnot. So we were like, let's create a league that does this. So we started, those one and done leagues locally, and we were like tracking in an Excel and everything. And this was before I joined Twitter. So then I'm like, you know what, this could be big. So I joined Twitter, and long and behold, one and done leagues are, they're common on Twitter. There's MFL, My Fantasy League, that tracks everything for you. So we're like, oh, okay. But then as I got more involved in Dynasty and promoting one and done leagues, I saw an opening to become an author, and I know I did a lot of research for redraft, so I kind of went hand in hand, and I started writing for the league winners. It was mainly focused on redraft, and a little bit focused on one and done leagues, and that kind of sort of morphed into an all year round endeavor.
That's great. How big of a shop is the league winners, and what specifically? How would you describe specifically your role there?
Right. So with the league winners, we do have a pretty good core group of writers, and then we have a lot of transient writers that come and go. But they've been around for, I believe, 4 years now. And what we're trying to do this season is sort of kind of take the next step and growing the league winners. And part of that's going to be more content, better website design, and also this project I'm coming out with, which is kind of taking my article series that are the game day edge, looking at weekly matchups of like a rushing offense versus the rushing defense, and creating like different graphics for yards per attempt, yards per carry, fantasy points given to running backs via the air or via the ground, and just creating like matchup charts on a week-to-week basis to help people make lineup decisions.
And just to make it very clear for our audience, where exactly can people find all of that?
Yep, just head on over to theleaguewinners.com, and that's the website, and you'll find everything on Twitter. It's at FF League Winners, and you can follow them on there, on Twitter, on Instagram, on YouTube, everywhere. It's the same.
Okay, great. That sounds like very interesting stuff and a little cutting edge. So that's good for the folks out there to know about. So in the category of small world, it turns out, and Prue and I realized this week. Prue and I have been in a big group chat together because we are both in the Scott Fish Bowl, which hopefully most people have heard of, but it's, I believe, the largest fantasy tournament out there with around 3,300 entries. It's for charity, for a charity called fantasycares.org, and they do like a huge Toys for Tots thing at the holidays. And Scott Fish, who has been around for a while in the fantasy and specifically the dynasty and developmental dynasty or Devi space, which I think he may even have been credited with inventing, put together this tournament, and we're now in the 13th year of it. This is my second year competing, and it just so happens Prue and I both got the 5th pick in the different divisions that we're in, and there's a big group chat of all the the 1.05 chat, all the people with the 5th pick. And again, because there's 3,000 plus people in the league, there's, a couple hundred divisions. We have about 100 people in this group chat. And it's been a great chat. People have been helping each other, providing, data and ADP and all these other things. So Prue and I have actually had some communication this week around some of our picks. But Prue, I know you did a live draft, which I'm just doing a slow draft. So maybe just tell us, we'll spend a couple minutes on this and then head into the main event tonight, which is the NFC East. But what was that live draft like, and how do you like your roster build so far?
Yeah, like you, this is my second year. Luckily, they also decided to do a live draft in Philly. So I signed up for it, and it was a blast. We had, over 50 people there. There were 4 divisions drafting live. The host, put on a great draft there. And it was great just meeting everyone, and everyone was in good moods. And you kind of, meet people that you've talked to on Twitter for the first time. Sarah drank together. And then you also, kind of learn everyone's little personality, and then you see how they draft. So it kind of, I think when we transitioned from the live draft to the slow draft portion after the 8th round, it helped our division chat kind of grow, because we had met up, and the communication just kind of became very organic at that point. As far as my roster build goes, I was telling Paul right before jumping on here live, I made a blunder. I missed a player that I was high on because he was kind of buried in the ADP. But so that sort of changed my path for the later parts of the draft. But I am overall happy with my team. I think it could compete. It's just a matter of staying active on waiver wires at that point. But I think I have a chance of making the playoffs.
Excellent.
Drew, can I ask, who's that player that you missed out
on? So with the Scott Fish Bowl 13, volume is king, right? So I ended up picking Terry McLaurin as my wide receiver 2, who I like a lot. But the player I should have picked was Miles Sanders, because I think he will get a pretty high percentage of the volume, especially early on in the season. And he would have been my RB2 and kind of given me the flexibility in the later parts of the draft, a bit more flexibility than having Terry McLaurin on my squad.
I got you.
Yeah, I got sniped by one pick on Sanders, but I still needed a second receiver and got a good one instead of him. But I was targeting him in, I believe it was the 5th round. I mean, the Scott Fish Bowl is interesting because it's a super flex league. It's a tight end premium, way premium, like double points for catches and first downs. There's no negative points anywhere this year. They juiced up the kick. I mean, the scoring is going to be like a pinball machine this year. So, everyone's going to come out of the draft thinking they have a great team and they're going to score lots of points, but everyone's going to score lots of points. And Prue made a good point. It's the kind of league where some people either lose interest or they kind of forget about it, or which is crazy because it's hard to get into. But the waiver wire, if you're one of the more active people on it, can make a difference. So anyway, it's been very fun being in that group chat with Prue, and I feel like I know you at least a little bit, which is good. And I wish you luck. And I like my roster build so far, but I'm way behind. We're only in the 7th round because we didn't have that live portion, and it's a slow draft where everyone has 8 hours to make a pick if they so choose. So it can take a while. It's like the whole week, which is kind of crazy because, you at some point you can't spend as much time thinking about each pick because you got to live your life. So anyway, we'll put that aside. But it has been fun, and I'm glad we got a chance to just talk about that for a minute. So, Paul, I'll turn it over to you. I think the first team we're going to talk about is these guys.
Yes, sir. This is kind of a fitting question with the recent report that came out today, Prue. Looking at Saquon Barkley, he's not satisfied, or he's not happy with the franchise tag. Are you worried at all that he'll hold out?
I mean, there is definitely a non-zero percentage chance that he may hold out and go the Le'Veon Bell route, knowing that he's already been injured once and he needs to secure his financial future. But I don't give it more than a 25% chance that he holds out. I think he's a player at heart. They'll figure something out as the offseason goes out on, or he may be playing for a free agency and a contract there, and he wants to still showcase that he has it in him. But like I said, it is a non-zero chance that he may hold out. So draft accordingly. Me personally, I would draft him, but I'm not going to have 100% exposure essentially.
Non-zero. I've never heard that term before. That might be the new term that takes over Twitter.
Let's talk now about the Giants quarterback. The first 3 years of his career, Daniel Jones really struggled on a struggling offense. His receivers kept getting hurt. They didn't have a very good offensive line. They didn't have very good coaching. He really was not in a position to succeed. Brian Daboll comes over after, working his magic with Josh Allen, and lo and behold, Daniel Jones turns in a top 10, borderline QB1 kind of season. The question I have for you, Prue, is do you think that was a fluke? He only threw 15 touchdown passes. His fantasy value really came from running, over 700 yards on the ground, 7 touchdowns. Do you think he can be counted on once again this year as a low-end QB1 or even better?
I definitely think he's a low-end QB1. And even in the 3 years that he was struggling, it was noticeable that rushing was his best weapon as well. And I think Brian Daboll just kind of unlocked that, right? Running a little bit more plays that allowed him to rush. And it's not like they brought in a ton of wide receiver help. I mean, they did bring wide receiver help, but it's not like any of them are alpha wide receivers. So I feel like there's still going to be a lot of RPOs and QB runs in that offense to keep the change moving. So just based on those plays, I think with his rushing floor, he's going to return low QB1 numbers. Now, does he take the next step and becomes Jalen Hurts? Again, I don't think so, because I think he lacks the weapons. I know they brought in Darren Waller, but outside of him, I don't see an alpha in the receiving corps. So I think, having expectations of a top 6 finish is too high.
Yeah, you mentioned the Giants bringing in weapons for Daniel Jones. I know you said that's a possibility that he finishes maybe still as a low-end QB1, but could you see him, even with the addition of Darren Waller and Paris Campbell, if maybe one of those guys breaks out, could you see him taking maybe a leap from an NFL and fantasy production?
Honestly, I think it's going to be more of the same as last year. I think it's just going to be that you're replacing the same tier wide receiver production. And I think Darren Waller does help with, catches over the middle and moving the chains. But I think that offense still runs through Saquon Barkley in the end. Now, if Saquon Barkley were to hold out, which, again, is a non-zero chance, then I could see Daniel Jones kind of be forced into making more plays and providing that QB1 level production.
So I'm glad you mentioned Darren Waller, because obviously he was the biggest name they added in the offseason to their offense. A few years ago, he had that one really big season, and he was kind of like after Kelsey, probably in the next second or third guy. But over the last 2 years, he's missed 13 games. Because his career took a while to get started, he's going to be 31 during this season. he is a very good bounce back candidate, especially because, as we were just talking about, it's not a very strong wide receiver room. It's kind of a lot of slot receivers and no real like deep threat or anything like that. Do you think he's worth taking, given the injury risk and everything else at his ADP, as a top 5 fantasy tight end this season?
I think you're drafting him at his ceiling. He has to return top 5 tight end just to give you value. And I think you could pivot to wide receivers or running backs in that range that give you a better opportunity. But as you said, um, you can't be drafting for injury risk all the time. So if he were to play a full season, I think he does return top 5 because of the lack of the weapons that the New York Giants have. And he's a big target in the red zone for Daniel Jones. So I think he'll start keying in on Waller in the red zone with the caveat, he's healthy. I feel like he's sort of become the new George Kittle, where you might be injured the second half of the game and then play again the next game. So that is maybe one headache that I wouldn't take. I'd rather go out and get the Steelers tight end at Fairmouth instead at a lower ADP.
You mentioned the Giants bringing in receivers. You look at Paris Campbell, Jamison Crowders. They brought back Isaiah Hodgins and Darius Slayton. Then they went out and drafted Jalen Hyatt. When you look at that group, who are you targeting in fantasy?
The 2 wide receivers I'll definitely be taking Wan'Dale Robinson because I think he's a gadget player, and I think Dable's going to have plays for him. Sort of the Curtis Samuel role from the Carolina Panthers. When he was playing for the Panthers. I think he's going to have legit flex availability. And if he starts showcasing his agility and open space evasiveness, he could start garnering more targets. And the other one is Darius Slayton. Main reason because they've got a plethora of slot receivers and Darren Waller and Saquon Barkley to go over the middle. They really don't have that outside guy to compete with Slayton. So Slayton's probably going to see a really high snap percentage. And he was coming on pretty well last year and getting a connection with Daniel Jones, but he kept getting injured, either in game or missing games. But I think Slayton is one of the wide receivers there that's going to have a pretty high snap percentage.
Yeah, it's been, as someone who sees the Giants up close a lot, the number of injuries to the wide receiver room they've had over the last couple of years has really been incredible. I mean, Kenny Golladay barely played for the team. Kadarius Toney barely got on the field, in his 2 years or 1 year with the Giants. Sterling Shepard just keeps getting hurt. It's crazy. It's like as soon as they step on the field, they step off the field. So hopefully, Giant fans are pretty optimistic coming off of a year where they went from, having the worst record in the NFL over the prior 3 seasons to not only getting in the playoffs, but winning a playoff game. So we'll now talk about Paul's favorite team. Paul is down in Texas. He's a big Cowboy fan, and another team in the division that not only made the playoffs last year, won a playoff game, Tom Brady's last career game. So you got that feather in your cap, Paul. Or we think it was his last career game. So we'll start with the quarterback. Prue, do you think Dak Prescott has already had his best season, or is there better fantasy production to come from him than what we've already seen? I think he's 29, Dak. So he's not old. He's had a couple of injuries, but what do you think?
I think from a fantasy production point, you may have seen his best season. The only difference might be is if with Zeke gone, he starts scoring a little bit more in the red zone through his legs. I think that propels him into the top 5. But we know Dak he's a really good quarterback, but he's not going to give you the Tom Brady or Peyton Manning, 40 plus touchdown um, uh, seasons, especially with Mike McCarthy as his coach, who has a leniency to start leaning on the running game as the season goes on. So it's not going to be as pass heavy, and I think that's one of the reasons you may not see Dak have one of those seasons for the ages. Again, there are some outlier cases where he scores 7 touchdowns by his using his legs, or there's a head coach change and they bring in someone that's really pass heavy. Or on the flip side, the Dallas D suddenly becomes horrible and they have to pass all game to catch up, which again is not going to happen. That's why I feel like he is who he is, which is a mid QB1.
All right, Prue. It was nice talking to you, man. We'll see you next time.
I know the truth hurts, but it's the truth.
No, in all seriousness, you look at Dak. I mean, they of course, CeeDee Lamb. He broke out last year. Michael Gallup recovering from injury, and then they bring in Brandon Cooks. And he mentioned with the loss of Zeke, maybe he'll go back to rushing a little bit more in the red zone. Do you think Dak is still a QB1 in fantasy?
Yeah, I definitely think he's a low end QB1. He's constantly going to finish anywhere from QB3 to QB12, depending on injury and whatnot. So he's a very reliable starter in fantasy.
Yeah, I agree. I'm excited to see what he can do this season. I just think when his offensive line is healthy, he's shown to be very efficient to put up numbers. And with the weapons that he had last year outside of CeeDee Lamb, it's kind of hard to rely on the receivers that he had. So I'm pretty excited as a Cowboys fan myself.
So speaking of changes in Dallas, Brian Schottenheimer in as the new offensive coordinator. Prue, do you see much of a change or an impact that could have on the team and especially from a fantasy perspective?
I don't think it's going to be as drastic of a change because it was a in-house promotion. I think the one fear I do have is that with Brian being in his first year, there might be a little bit more Mike McCarthy influence on the offense and the play calling. So you may see a little bit of leniency towards the rushing attack. But overall, I feel like, Dallas has been running a very efficient offense for the last 2 years. And I think it's status quo moving forward into 2023.
Yeah, one player I think a lot of fantasy players and especially fantasy Twitter's excited about is Tony Pollard. But, with Zeke now gone and the year that he had last year, he's taken a rise in ADP. When you think about that, is Tony Pollard still somebody that you value, or has his rise in ADP, made him less appealing?
He's definitely risen a lot to the point where you are drafting him at his ceiling. So anything besides, a top half RB1 finish, you're losing value.
Exactly.
But the excitement is warranted, right? He has shown that he's explosive, he's efficient with his runs. The only question is, can he handle the workload? I think actually if Dallas does bring someone in like Dalvin Cook or Kareem Hunt, it's actually a boon for Pollard because it makes sure that he's not the running back with the entire workload.
So I was thinking of some. Oh, I did have a follow up to this. Sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. And really, maybe Paul, there's a question for you. Zeke hasn't signed anywhere yet. We'll talk about the 0% chance again. Do you think that there's a chance that Zeke doesn't really find a starting job somewhere else necessarily, and Dallas brings back a guy who's knows everything in the playbook and signs for less money and comes back to the Cowboys?
I don't know, because when you hear Stephen Jones, when he was talking earlier, talking about the value of the running back, and you look at the moves that Dallas made on the coaching staff and everything. I think they want to change their identity on offense, maybe be a little bit faster, be more efficient. And Zeke was everything but that last season. So unless Jerry kind of makes the decision, and kind of steps on Steven's toes, if you will, and Zeke's willing to take a bit of a pay cut, I can't see Ezekiel Elliott coming back to Dallas.
Okay. I was curious about that. So Prue, Dallas has pretty strong receiver room. They already had CeeDee Lamb and Michael Gallup. Now Brandon Cooks joins the team. I think it's his 32nd team, and in the 8 or 9 years he's been in the NFL. It's amazing how that guy has been everywhere. But he's been very productive other than last season. So from a fantasy perspective, how are you approaching the Dallas receivers, maybe besides CeeDee Lamb, who's kind of an obvious top 10 guy?
I wish Brandon Cooks has played for all 32 teams, because I would have loved him on the Ravens. I was begging for them to sign him a couple of years back. But outside of CeeDee Lamb, I'm taking shots at Gallup. I think the addition of Cooks and being finally healthy entering a season, I think it provides Gallup the opportunity to get some looks that are more open, and he has a knack of catching the ball in contested areas and making those difficult catches. So I think Cooks sort of helps Gallup's game, where I'm taking Gallup at a lower ADP than Cook in many drafts.
Yeah, you look at those receivers, CeeDee Lamb, Brandon Cooks, and Michael Gallup. Compared to the rest of the division, do the Cowboys have the best wide receiver group?
Oh, that's interesting. I don't think so, just because you have really two elite receivers in the Eagles.
Yeah.
I mean, they're by far, superior. They're essentially two CeeDee Lambs. So at that point,
wow.
that sort of just kind of tips the scale into the Eagles' favor. And they run an offense that optimizes both A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith's skill set. So even in the decline in the third wide receiver there, I think the Eagles take the cake just based on those two top wide receivers.
I think it's fair to say that the Giants are last in that division because we'll talk about the Commanders now, and they've got a strong wide receiver room too, but the quarterback there is definitely a question mark. Sam Howell got in some games at the very end of the season, including that game where they dismantled the Cowboys, which was a kind of a shocking game at the end of the season. And he looked okay, but I've already seen it, like in the Scott Fishbowl draft, that the Commanders receivers are getting drafted below their ability because of the quarterback situation. So that's my question for you, Prue. And you actually already mentioned that you took McLaurin in the Scott Fishbowl, but how do you feel about these receivers at their ADP? How much do you trust them and the quarterback play?
Yeah, so Terry McLaurin has already shown that he can produce with bad quarterbacks and bad offenses. So I think that's out of the question, right? He's going to produce no matter what. But add in Dotson and his capability that he showed when he was on the field with the quarterbacks they had last year, it goes to show that those two are very good when they're both on the field. So I do see a very concentrated wide receiver target share, similar to what the Eagles have in their top two wide receivers for the Commanders.
Yeah, and you look at Curtis Samuel. He was showing signs of life early last year with Carson Wentz, and you think about the Commanders bringing Eric Bieniemy, who's with his time in Kansas City, should bring a breath of fresh air to that offense. What do you think his year one impact will be with the Commanders?
I think he's going to bring that fresh air. I think you may see it where the first quarter of the season they may get to a slow start as they are learning the offense.
Yeah.
But I am banking on the Commanders being a very prevalent offense in the second half of the season as they start learning the offense, gelling together, and kind of buying into Eric's coaching.
That's a good point.
We'll stay there with Eric Bieniemy. Which position group on the team do you think benefits the most from him coming over?
That's a really tough question because I am very 50-50 on this between the wide receivers and the running backs, but I'm going to go with the running backs. They're sort of the non-chalk answer there. I feel like last year both Robinson and Gibson showed that when given the opportunity, they were productive. Maybe not efficient in Robinson's case, but productive. And I think there was a bit of touchdown regression for the running backs last year. So I think Eric Bieniemy is going to lean on that run game to alleviate a little bit of pressure from Howell, and maybe use a little bit of checkdowns and zone runs to help Howell do some play action passes to the passing game. So I think the running backs, are drastically undervalued in fantasy at the moment.
Agreed. And one skill group that still has some questions is the quarterbacks. And you look at Jacoby Brissett and Sam Howell, regardless of maybe who the starter is, are the Commanders skill players good enough to make those guys, either one of those guys, fantasy viable?
Yeah, like I said, I think Eric Bieniemy is a very good offensive coordinator, and he understands who his playmakers are. Right,
yeah.
He's going to quickly realize he doesn't have a Travis Kelce at the tight end unless somehow Logan Thomas rejuvenates himself. So his best four players are going to be his top two wide receivers and his top two running backs, and he's going to feature them. And Eric Bieniemy has a chip on his shoulder as well, right? He had to take a lateral move to potentially get a head coaching job. So I think especially Dotson and the two running backs, they are heavily discounted fantasy players, and they're going to outperform their ADPs. So I am heavily high on those three at cost.
So we've been talking, hinting at the quarterback competition there that might be. I'm a believer that Sam Howell will start week one, and it's kind of his job to lose. But the Scott Fish Bowl is a super flex league. Prue, I'm sure you've played in some other super flex leagues. Do you think Howell is a viable QB2 in a super flex? Are you buying or selling there?
I'm definitely buying, especially if in startup drafts, if I'm punting QB. He's one of my main targets. I'm usually pairing him with Jordan Love and Desmond Ridder to hope that one of the two will become fantasy viable. But again, I think the offensive coordinator there will help Howell be QB relevant. It may be the second half of the season where he starts producing at a high end QB2, low end QB1 level. But again, that's you're drafting him at a discounted value.
Yeah, he got, just as an aside, and he got taken in my Scott Fish Bowl division in the early 7th round, and before Matthew Stafford and some other, before Ryan Tannehill, before some kind of proven veterans that you kind of know what you're getting. So I think there are, I think people look, like you said, I think people look at the skill position players they have and say, and I think they have a decent offensive line too, and just say he's got a chance. But he does have to win the job first.
Yeah, I completely agree. He does have to win the job in training camp and wow the coaches, because Jacoby Brissett has shown that he's a great starter. But like you said, the skilled players just give him a chance. So if he wins that job, that's a QB1 you're getting in the late rounds maybe not in your division in the seventh round, but in most Scott Fitz divisions or starter drafts, you're getting him pretty late.
Yeah.
You mentioned being excited for the backfield with under the influence of Eric Bieniemy's offense. You look at a guy like Antonio Gibson, who was a wide receiver in college. We all know that. And he's more the explosive guy. And then you've got Brian Robinson, where you mentioned that he was inefficient last year. How do you see the usage in this backfield playing out?
I think it's pretty much what everyone kind of sees, right? You got Robinson as the first and second down back, and Gibson as the third down passing back. But the only caveat I will say that is if Robinson is still inefficient in the red zone, Gibson is going to take over that backfield if he starts scoring in the red zone quickly. But I think, based on the Chiefs' history, they're going to just ride their hot end. And I think both of them are going to see touches throughout the game. And based on game script, one or the other is going to be viable option that week.
Which brings that sort of raises a question. Do you think that both Gibson and Brian Robinson could be viable in a best ball format?
They're completely viable in a best ball format. And if you're definitely going 0 RB, get them both, because you're giving an RB1 production week in and week out in best ball.
Yeah, I should have clarified. I meant on the same team, like drafting them both and figuring that week in and week out, one of them is going to give you RB1 numbers, hopefully.
Yeah, I think that's a good option. Sorry, Paul.
No. Sorry about that, guys. Another backfield that's interesting for not just best ball, but fantasy in general is the Eagles' backfield. They go out and they trade for DeAndre Swift, and they sign Rashad Penny to a cheaper deal, but we know the potential's there. When you look at that backfield, what are your thoughts on Swift at ADP and just that backfield in general?
I think it's going to be very similar to last year, where you had Sanders as the RB1, but then you saw the Eagles sprinkle in Gainwell and Boston Scott when they needed to. And I think that's essentially what they're doing with Swift and Penny. They know that they both are injury risks, and they both provide high value efficient touches when on the field. So there might be games where some fantasy football owners were frustrated with Sanders having a bust game, scoring 4 points, and Gainwell getting like 2 touchdowns. You might see that again this year, and there's talk in training camp that Gainwell is gaining traction there as well. So it's going to be a running back by committee, but I definitely want one of the running backs, because that is a run. It's a very high efficient run game, especially with the threat of Hurts running the ball. So if either one of them gets injured, the other one catapults into an RB1 discussion. So you definitely want shares of Swift and Penny and Gainwell at that point.
Yeah, it's one of the more confusing backfields, I think, because honestly, their best running back is Jalen Hurts, right? Like he had the second most rushing touchdowns in the NFL last year behind Jamal Williams. So the Boston Scott, they sprinkle in when they need a touchdown against the Giants. It's uncanny. Every time they play the Giants, that guy's dancing in the end zone. But you mentioned Kenneth Gainwell and kind of a bit of hype around him, even with the 2 backs they brought in. Are you buying into that hype? What do you think about Gainwell this year?
I'm not buying into the hype. I'm buying into the player situation, because he is playing behind 2 injury-prone RBs, and he's shown that he can produce when he's on the field. So I'm buying more of the situation than the hype. And I think the hype is more because he's just getting the opportunities in mini camps and training camps, whereas they're resting Swift and Penny. And we already know whoever gets touches out of that backfield is going to be efficient in that run game. So Gainwell at cost, he's he's a true handcuff because he's handcuffing 2 players, not 1.
Yeah, you mentioned the running back usage. Maybe 1 week it's Penny, 1 week it could be Swift, 1 week it could be Gainwell. You look at this running back room. Are they only good for best ball?
They're definitely better for best ball, but I do feel that either Penny or Swift, if they are healthy for the entire season, will give you a Sanders-like season from last year. It just you don't know who it is right now, unfortunately.
Yeah.
This offense was a juggernaut last year, with a whole bunch of very good fantasy producers across the board. They also had one of the easiest schedules in the league. The whole NFC East, because they played the NFC North and, more importantly, the AFC South, they all kind of had, favorable schedules. Do you see the Eagles, kind of being right back to where they were last year from a fantasy perspective, or do you think maybe they take a step back, or at least a little step back this year?
I mean, I think it's natural for them to take a step back, but with Jalen Hurts there, I think there'll still be an upper echelon offense. I'll give it 1 more year until I, kind of give them the treatment of the Buffalo Bills and the Bengals and the Chiefs, who've shown it for multiple years that they are an upper echelon offense. But I do believe that the Eagles have married the best offensive coaching to the players that they have, and I think that marriage works really, really well. But with that said, I think as they start facing a little bit more tougher divisions, I don't think they're running away with the games like they were last year.
Yeah, and they lost their offensive coordinator too, so we'll see if that has an impact also.
Yep, there's going to be some growing pains there.
You mentioned the Eagles having the best wide receiver group in this division, and Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown. When you look at their current ADPs and their value and production, who do you think is Devontae Smith the better pick over A.J. Brown this year?
Just because he is going maybe a round or a round and a half later, yes. Just based on that fact. But just based on that fact, because I think they both are 1A and 1B in the offense, and I think taking someone else besides AJ Brown and picking up Devontae, you could pair Devontae with an elite running back at that point. You can go hero RB at that point, and you kind of get the same kind of production you do between the 2 wide receivers. So I think for the opportunity cost in the draft room, you get a similar type player in Devontae Smith.
I like them both.
Yeah, it's hard to say. It's kind of hard to pick one.
And it's such a funnel offense, like the ball goes in the air, goes to 3 guys, maybe 4 this year with Swift. But all right, now we're gonna go through a few questions where we're each gonna give an answer. So the first one is, we'll start with you, Prue. Which player are you buying in the NFC East?
Brian Robinson. I think he's going to get he has a chance of getting more than 200 rush attempts, and there's a touchdown positive regression for him coming. So I think I'm definitely buying Brian Robinson this year.
I like that one. That's a good one.
Paul, how about you?
For me, Prue mentioned him earlier. I'm going with my guy, Michael Gallup. He has an ADP outside the top 150, and you look at the addition of Brandon Cooks, and I feel like Gallup has been forgotten by fantasy managers, and now he's going to be facing the opponent's cornerback 3. He's a year removed from his ACL and overcoming that mental hurdle he was dealing with last season. I feel like Gallup can slide into your flex spot and put up wide receiver 2 numbers any given week.
All right.
How about you, Dave?
I don't know if this qualifies as a sleeper or not, but I'm buying Sam Howell. I just think that he'll win that job. I liked what I saw at the end of last season. I like the coaching change there. I like the ownership change there. I think it's a fresh start for the whole organization. And He's got good weapons, and I think he's going to be fantasy viable as a high end QB2 in super flexes. So I was actually, I already have 2 quarterbacks in my Scott Fishbowl draft, but I was hoping to get him as my third. And as I said, he disappeared in the 7th round. I realized that could have been my sleeper, but I am buying him. Go ahead, Paul. You get the next one.
Prue, we talked about our buys. Who are you selling in the NFC East?
I think at cost, maybe that's a tough one. I haven't really thought of that. I haven't come up with a good answer, but unfortunately, I might have to go with Terry McLaurin in this one.
Oh, scary Terry. Okay.
Yeah. I think if you draft him in the range of, the right after Amari Cooper, around the time when Deebo Samuel and Chris Godwin are going, I think that might be a little too high. I think you're drafting him at his ceiling. I'd rather have Godwin at that point.
Oh, wow.
I think he still produces, but the opportunity cost is maybe a little too high. I'd rather have Dotson several rounds later.
So Prue took my answer. While you were busy thinking of someone, I was like, don't say Terry McLaurin, because that's the answer too. I just think, as much as I have some confidence in Sam Howell, McLaurin is sort of being thought of as a very high-end wide receiver too. And I just think with multiple receivers there, plus Gibson, plus tight ends, I just don't think he'll get the target share that is needed for him to meet his ADP. So, and I just, I think it may take a little while, as we've been talking about, for that offense to really get going. So I think people who take McLaurin might be a little frustrated again, especially early in the season, like they were last year. Paul, who's your guy?
Yeah, this might be low-hanging fruit, but I'm trying to trade Saquon wherever I had him. I actually sent out an offer, Saquon Barkley for Stephon Diggs straight up. We'll see what happens there, but with this potential contract holdout, and he hasn't always been the healthiest guy. I think he still has the name value. I feel like he can still get a nice hefty return for him. So I'm parting with Saquon Barkley.
All right, now let's go to sleepers. Prue, who's your favorite sleeper in the NFC East this season?
I'm going to go with Jake Ferguson.
Hey, Fergie.
Dak loves throwing to tight ends, and now Schultz is gone, and they brought in rookie tight ends, so everyone's on the rookie tight ends. But they forget Ferguson had a pretty good role last year, and now he's entering year 2 of the offense. So it's not like he's just going to, lay down and hand over the jobs to the rookies. And I think Dak is going to trust Ferguson to take over the tight end role there. And his ADP is so drastically low that so anyone in my Geno Steak division, do not listen to this podcast just yet. I'm kind of giving away one of my sleepers, but hopefully they're not listening. Otherwise, but yeah, I'm high on Jake Ferguson.
Paul?
I like that answer a lot. For me, call me a homer, but I've been stashing Jalen Tolbert everywhere I can. Dallas put a lot on his plate last year as a rookie, and everything that could go wrong went wrong for him. But he's been working with Dak Prescott and Brandon Cooks all off season. With his rookie year in the rearview mirror and a clean slate, he's one injury away from being a starter in 3 wide receiver sets, and he was pretty good in college. And I think he with his work ethic, I think Dak is somebody that likes guys that put in the work, and he could gain Dak's trust. And when you do that, a lot of good things can happen for you. How about you, Dave?
Well, I kind of already gave mine away, which was Sam Howell, at least for the second half of the season. But I don't know if Rashad Penny can count as a sleeper just because he's a prominent name, but at the price you can get him, and the potential of either Swift getting hurt or Swift really just being used mostly in the passing game, and behind that great offensive line, we saw a couple years ago down the stretch where Penny was the RB1 over the last 6 weeks of the 2021 season. Like he's got talent. He's just never been able to stay on the field. But I think, they brought him in for a reason, obviously. And as much as it's a crowded backfield, I think at the price you're getting him, he's kind of a lottery ticket just waiting to happen, or not. But that's, you're not giving up the kind of draft capital to arguably get the number one running back or the early down back on that team. So I kind of like him as a sleeper. Antonio Gibson too. He's also really cheap.
Yeah.
He's if not double digit rounds, like 9th round, and for a guy who's been overhyped all of his other seasons, he's almost fallen to being a sleeper.
All right, you don't strike me as a bold take guy. You strike me as somebody who's pretty calculated. But just for the fun of the episode, for the sake of the episode, give me one NFC East edition bold take.
I think the Commanders make the playoffs this year.
Oh, I like that.
I think, one of the other NFC East teams falters due to expectations, and the Commanders sneak in. And we already know when, the divisional games, it's the throw in the air. Even last year, like Commanders, giving it to the Cowboys and, making the Eagles sweat as well. So I think NFC East has shown time in and time again that the second place team is usually someone new. So I think the Commanders might take that step forward.
Dave, how about you?
Yeah, I'm almost tempted to say, all 4 teams make the playoffs, but I just think that's impossible. I think it's too hard. The NFC is almost weak enough where it could happen. But I think the Seahawks will be a wild card. I think the Seahawks and 49ers will both make the playoffs. So you'll get 3 from the NFC East again. But my bold call, I'm not sure how bold this is, but I think that of all the top wide receiver duos in the NFL, so Cincinnati, Miami, Philadelphia, I guess those would be the top 3, that in terms of fantasy points, Brown and Smith will have the most combined as compared to either Waddle and Hill or Higgins and Chase or anyone else. And I think the reason is just how much, even though they're not a high volume passing offense, everything, Goddard gets a little, but everything goes to those 2 guys. And I think this year the Eagles are going to have to throw more. I just don't see, they had all those games last year where they scored like 25 points in the second quarter and the game was over in the second half and Hurts didn't really have to throw it. I think it's going to be a higher volume offense, and I think those 2 guys are both going to go off.
I like that one. That's a good one. For me is the Dallas Cowboys will have 3 receivers reach 1,000 receiving yards or more in 2023.
Wow.
That's a bold take.
So you have Dak throwing for probably close to 5,000 then.
At least I don't think 4,200 is out of the realm of possibility.
All right,
here we are. Prue, we're wrapping things up, but before we get you out of here, again, you spoke on it earlier, but let the people know what content you're producing, where they can find it, and what to expect from you this off season.
Yeah, definitely. You can find me on Twitter at the Prue Patel, and I do write for the League Winners at theleaguewinners.com, and I'll be also writing a little mix of financial advice and fantasy advice at inbetweenmedia.com starting soon.
And Dave, remind the people they can find you on Twitter, sir.
All right. The first thing I'm going to say is people should not take financial advice from me. So I'm not going to write. I'm not going to write anything that could be construed as financial advice. You can find me on Twitter at Pigskin Papers. My website is thepigskinpapers.com. My most recent article up there is redraft QB rankings and tiers, and I'll have a bunch of other stuff coming up throughout July and August to help get people ready for their drafts in redraft leagues. And Paul, where can everyone find you and your content?
Yes, you can find my content every Monday. I stream a Dallas Cowboys themed episode with my guy CD Piglet, and every Wednesday I'm here with my guy David Hartman here, and you can find our episodes on Twitter and YouTube as well. And you can find me on Twitter at Paula_Ryan15. We appreciate you joining us, and we'll see you guys next week.